welcome to class this week. I hope you're all doing well. I'm going to launch into it because that's what I do. But there will be time. Hey Matt, there's like, the chairs all filled up. There's chairs in that room next door.
I'll go grab some.
There's a piano bench. That room right next door, there's chairs you can just grab. I will be doing Q&A sessions as part of this class. So if you do have questions, we'll be having time to do that. But I usually push those off a little bit until I've done a few of the early lectures, so that we give you a grounding and a foundation and kind of some of the basics. And then we start doing more. What are you guys interested in knowing? Today, on our little paradigm over here, if you remember, plot, setting, character, conflict, we're actually going to talk about this thing over here, which is prose, which is kind of the style you use to tell your story in. Because I gave you, theoretically, a quick rundown on the other three things last week, and now we'll talk about some of these prose issues. This is partially selfish on my part, because I'm reading, you're writing, those of you who are in the workshop portion of the class, and I want you to get better at that to make it more enjoyable for me as soon as possible. But I say that jokingly, here's the thing. So, this stuff right here, the plot, setting, character, this is actually the hard stuff, okay? The plot, setting, character. This is the stuff that's going to take a long time to master. You've got a weird situation in the first people when people first pick up your book, whether they be an editor, a potential buyer, or someone who's already, bought the book, or whatever it is, or even if it's just a roommate, they are going to notice all of this stuff first. They're going to judge whether they keep reading based on this. If you'll remember from last week, there's the prose and style. This is what they're going to do. They'll get a little bit of the character, conflict, setting, plot, but it's going to be filtered through this lens over here on how you're presenting that. And then, so if you're able to construct this really awesome, intricate plot that through the course of a large-scale storytelling form, through a novel, things are interweaving and coming together with a boom at the end, which is very hard to do. If you are a master of that, but you can't grab them in the first 5 pages, you're going to have a much tougher time with your book. All right? Doesn't mean that book will be a failure. There are some readers who are more accommodating. If you can gain word of mouth, and they say, yes, this is one of those books that's worth investing time in, then you can still have books that really take off. But it's a little bit harder, particularly to get published in the first place, if you can't do this stuff up front. And so it's weird kind of push and shove between how good is your prose and how good is this. I mean, another thing even beyond this is your query, which we'll talk about eventually, which is when you're trying to sell something just off your query. I've known people who are fantastic at queries, but not good at any of this other stuff, so they always get people asking for they're like, oh, your query's awesome, let me see your piece, and then they never get picked up or anything like that. Actually, a bigger problem is most of us are terrible at queries because we've practiced all of this stuff, and this is more like what they learned in the Marriott School, which we stay really far away from. Except for the ones that are in the Marriott. Who's in the Marriott School here? Yeah, except for you. Oh, the accountant. Hi. Yeah.
Tax lecture, Brendan.
What's that?
Just saying, I'm going to wait until the tax lecture.
Yeah. But anyway, there's kind of this weird contrast between those things. But I want to talk about this stuff, and I'm not just going to talk about the prose stuff. I really mean style here. I mean things like viewpoint and tense and whatnot. So let's talk about this. I've often said that, particularly in epic fantasy, one of the grand skills to learn is how to convey information about setting and character in an interesting way. In other words, how to info dump. The people who are best at info dumping tend to have a big leg up in publishing in science fiction and fantasy, because if you can get across this information very easily and in a very fun way, suddenly people want to read, they're learning about your world, and things like this. Coming to this, kind of one of the prefaces I like to say, is something we call learning curve. So, learning curve. Every story has what we call a learning curve. This is how much the reader has to figure out as they're reading along before they really gain competence and mastery in the book. And so the learning curve has kind of two factors. How high does it go? You know, if we've got our graph here of learning curve, and how fast does it get there? Right? How fast does someone get brought up to speed? Now, you might have a book where the learning curve is down here, where, you know, it's a book that's, whose audience, it's for instance, it's taking place in a familiar setting to the audience. The characters are very familiar types of characters, and the conflicts are very familiar types of conflict. Having a character whose name is Robert is a lot easier for people to remember than a character whose name is Garthnab, or something like this, right? A book that takes place in a school that is intended for people going to school has a much shallower learning curve, generally, than a book that is taking place on a gas giant with aliens who live in a gas giant who don't go to school but instead exchange information telepathically, right? And so we are all here in this class because we like science fiction fantasy, unless it's an accident, I'm sorry. If you thought you were signing up for something else, guess what? So we like learning curves. But you are going to want to judge your learning curve for your audience and for your own personal goals. And generally, the shallower the learning curve, meaning the incline of it, the better, regardless of what genre you're in. Now, an epic fantasy, you can't get it too shallow because it's not going to work. But you want to mitigate that as much as possible, because you want the readers to be grabbed by conflict and character. Plot is part of that, but you don't want them distracted by the setting, even though we all read fantasy and science fiction for the setting. It's this weird thing. If you think about it, I fell in love with fantasy books because of all the cool setting elements. I was bored by regular books. I kept being given these books. I think I told you about boys living in the rural South, and everything's dreadful, and they don't like their school, or they have a pet dog, and then the dog dies, and then mom dies, and everyone's sad, but then they get over it, and that's the end, or whatever. I mean, I hated these books. And then I started reading fantasy books, and I'm like, these are so awesome. No dogs are dying, instead they're fighting dragons. This is great. This is awesome. I love this. And that's what captures us. It's this imaginative genre. We love the imagination of it. At the same time, we want to capture, rather than having people slam into a brick wall of world building. And this is one way that the genre, I feel, has evolved across the last 20 years, as we've become better at learning curves. If you go back to some of the older books, the learning curves can be more brick wallish. But even still, a lot of the greats, you'll find that they do certain things in order to help with learning curve. So let me ask you guys, what have you seen authors do in this context? Can you pick out anything they've been doing in order to keep their learning curve more shallow? Yeah.
Harry Potter, he starts out in our world.
He starts out in our world, that's right. One of the great archetypes of the fantasy novel is the kid who falls through a rabbit hole, right? It goes all the way back to Alice in Wonderland, start in our world, transition to the fantasy world. What that does is, you hit us with character very quickly, and then you transition to these awesome setting things, which we have character under our feet. So that's a way that we build learning curve. What's another way?
Introducing elements by explaining them to characters I'm familiar with.
Okay, a Watson. Yes. I'll put this list up here. I like that. Rabbit hole. Watson. Okay, how does the Watson character work?
My favorite example is in Harry Potter book 2, actually, where Harry Potter explains the game of Quidditch to the reader by explaining it to Colin Creevey, who has no idea what's going on.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And why this works is this is kind of a tool for keeping our learning curve a little more shallow, for getting an information across in an interesting way. I would say that this actually is less to do with the shallowness of the learning curve, and more doing this, presenting the input up in an engaging way, which are similar skills. But it's definitely something we want to be talking about here, okay? So I don't think that makes it any shallower, but it helps. Matt?
Limiting the number of viewpoint characters you
Okay.
introduce, not jumping
Yes.
through heads.
Okay, perfect. Why would that do it? Why would that make our learning curve shallower?
If it's from a single person's perspective, you don't have to keep trying to reorient yourself as the reader. You can just see it from where they are and go from there.
Excellent. This is why the rise of the first person or the third limited has become the modern standard as opposed to the omniscient. Which, if you go back in time, you will find way more omniscient books. I will define all these things in a few minutes for those who are confused by what it is. But this is really a learning curve issue. This is why we're doing this. Great. There were other hands up that had, yes?
Starting with a familiar event like the dinner parties in Lord of the Rings.
Right, yeah. Familiar event. So, yes, we're in this fantastical world of another place, but we're going to start at the beginning of The Hobbit with, people coming over for dinner unexpectedly. We're going to start The Lord of the Rings. We start with a birthday party, right? We start with familiar events, and then we transition into the very strange. That's why the farm boy who goes on a quest is such a well-used, perhaps worn a little thin trope in the fantasy, is because, yes, your fantasy world's got all these weird things going on, but a guy living on a farm, you probably had some experience with that. You probably learned your farm animals as a kid. You know what it's like. It's a familiar part of that world, and then you transition into it. Starting in school is another reason why, the wizard school actually is a lot of times more familiar to us than a lot of the things that other people could be doing in that world. So yes, great one. Were there any others? Yeah.
Mentioning details or things that we are familiar with, and then describing in depth what it is a little bit later. Like,
Okay.
Reading Perdido Street Station, that's what he's doing a lot.
Yeah. This is in the same category. It might be more on this thing over here, but what they're doing right there is they're avoiding info dumps early. Maybe, I think that's what you're talking about. Meaning, sometimes you can mention something and you can not have to describe it right at that moment. Now, this is a tricky one because every word you add or concept you add that is different in the world from our world is going to increase your learning curve a little bit. But sometimes, instead of saying, and that was this, you just have the characters mention it. The reader's like, oh, this is some weird thing, or, something's odd about this. The clocks are striking 13, right? That's the first line of 1942. Mentions the clock striking 13. Suddenly you've got this weirdness already that's a transition from something familiar to strange, but you don't go into then a long explanation of why they decided to have a 13-hour clock. You avoid the info dump. One place that I've done this, I started the first Mistborn book. One of my goals with Mistborn was I would assume that many of you are familiar with it during this class, but my very first book was called Elantris. And Elantris, I was not as quite aware of these things. Elantris has a very steep learning curve. My world building, particularly my linguistics, were very unique. I spent a long time on the linguistics. All the names were kind of odd and hard to say. The situations from the get-go were I'm doing some of this stuff instinctively, but some of it I'm not doing. When I got to Mistborn, I'm like, I want this to be a little more accessible. I'm dealing with a thieving crew. I want them to have names that make sense, that are kind of like, riffs on common things. Instead of calling someone Raoden, I'm going to call them Breeze, and things like this. So it emphasizes this whole thieving crew. They all have nicknames. And one of the decisions I made very early in that is, even though magic systems are kind of my thing, I skipped the scene where Kelsier uses the magic in the prologue or chapter 1. The very first thing is, we got this guy who comes out of the mist. He meets with the peasants who are beaten down. He's like, I'm going to go do something awesome. And then he steps out to do something awesome, and we skip it. And then we show the aftermath of, wow, that guy just totally killed a whole bunch of people. And my intentional goal on this was, I don't want chapter 1 of this to be, bam, magic system. Now, if you've read a book of mine called The Way of Kings, The Way of Kings, I'm like, hopefully you've already read Mistborn, or hopefully you've heard about that this is my book for people who like epic fantasy. And chapter 1, I'm going to show you what you're getting into. So that if you want to put the book down, you can, because bam, magic system, right? That one, chapter 1, after the prologue, is this guy doing all sorts of cool, awesome stuff with the magic. And in that one, I skip viewpoints. I go to like 4 different viewpoint characters in the first 4 chapters. And I did this all quite intentionally to say, all right, guys, steep learning curve book. All right? It's 1,000 pages long. We've got a steep learning curve. Now, that's kind of violating that whole make the learning curve as shallow as possible, but again, that's to achieve whatever goals you want to do. Does anyone here read Stephen Erickson? Stephen Erickson has made a name for himself by having learning curves that are like that. Okay? And that is the fun of a Stephen Erickson book. The world building is fantastic. And you pick those up and you just have to just say, I trust you. I'm going to go along with it. I have no idea what's going on at all. I think I'll figure it out eventually. And some of us really enjoy that, right? And that's a selling point of his books, okay? Doing that as a YA book, trying to sell, is going to be a very bad idea. Were you going to say something?
I'm not sure if it's quite relevant, but one of my favorite uses of a steep learning curve like this was Michael Crichton's Timeline. It's a book centered around time travel, but the mechanics of how it actually works are a little fuzzy.
Yeah.
So when he explains the concept of time travel, the learning curve just jumps up to like almost a straight line.
Yeah.
And my impression of why he did that was he was trying to confuse the readers so they assumed they knew what he was talking about.
Okay. I remember that scene. So yeah. So anyway, these are all tools again in your writing quiver, deciding what you want your learning curve to be. And generally, the more trusted you are as a writer, and the more kind of in your genre you are and giving the right cues, the more you can kind of play with this. As I said, with YA and particularly middle grade, YA and middle grade, your learning curve, you kind of have to be very careful about it. You can be very wacky in your world building. It doesn't have to make logical sense. But you've got to ground people with conflict and character very quickly in those books and allow then the whimsical sense to take over. So I want you to be aware of as you're writing your books is the idea of learning curve. What are you asking of your readers? And as you are applying, as you're writing, say, your query letters eventually, or your blurb for your book if you're self-publishing it, you want to be really aware of learning curve. You want to make this learning curve so incredibly shallow, you want to get across one concept really well in an engaging way and leave out all the weird names. This is the art of writing queries and blurbs, is to be like, this is something you can latch onto. Here is a character who's been framed for murder and is trying to find the person who actually did it, or something like that. Like, you do that rather than saying, someone's name lives in this kingdom, which has a history of this, and suddenly this other person, this weird magical thing happens to, and you get into all of that steep learning curve, and then people are going to read that and be like, the blurb is a brick wall. I don't want to know what the book is. And often, if you can shallow your learning curve, particularly as a new writer, it's a good thing to keep in mind. So, we're going to talk about this prose. And I'm going to start by talking about the idea of viewpoint, since it was brought up over here. So, next heading, viewpoint. Viewpoint and tense. Viewpoint, mastery of viewpoint as a genre fiction writer is one of those things that will sell your books on a couple of pages. Okay? It's probably unfair that you get judged so quickly. At the same time, if you remember my example of the pianist from a few weeks ago, how playing the piano and writing are kind of similar, learning an instrument, we could pick someone in here who plays the piano, and we could put them up at this piano and have them play for a few minutes, And you would be able to tell very quickly how good they are. Don't you think? Then you can have me bang out a scale and maybe chopsticks. And you'd say, wow, this person is not as good at piano. It's not as great a comparison, because really what we would want is we'd want a student who's been practicing a year. Because you all have been practicing a decent amount of your writing. We want someone who's done some piano playing, who knows their way around a song. And then we want to bring in the master pianist. You want to have them both play. You can tell fast, quickly, who is who. The readers also can do this. They can read, and they will know pretty early on. They'll get a sense if this is a book they want to read or not. Editors are even better at it. And so the fact that you're going to be getting judged very quickly is in some ways unfair. But also, if you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing, they can tell very early on that you have had the training. One of these is mastery of viewpoint. A lot of new writers, in fact, I would hazard a guess that almost every new writer pays very little attention to viewpoint. They just start writing, which is good. We want you to write. We want you to practice writing. However, modern books, particularly in science fiction and fantasy, use viewpoint as a tool. So, let's describe these. Let's do our 3 basic viewpoints. And let's have you guys talk a little bit about them and what they do. So, we have first person. And we're going to talk about what different tools what these different tools do, right? We've got third, limited, and we've got omniscient. Now, we still get books published, successful books published, in all 3 of these viewpoint styles in science fiction and fantasy today. The book I'm reading right now is Omniscient, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Nora. And so, you still end up with omniscient. I don't want to say you can't do omniscient. I want to say you have to consciously choose your viewpoint and show it forth in a masterful way. So, what is first person? I do this. All right. This is the I went to the store. In fact, I'm going to take out those because you start your book with let's use something that would actually start a book. All right. I want this to kind of be easy. Yes, Call Me Ishmael is a great first-person opening. So, first person, I was on the way to the store. Don't start your book with that line. That's a bad line to start a book, but we're going to make this easy. So, third person, how would you write it?
John was on the way to the store.
How about Joe was on the way to the store? All right. Pet peeve of mine and of a large number of editors, as my writing group that I was in last week found out, is starting your book without a named protagonist when you're in third person. People do it all the time. It's very, very common. Rarely is there a reason for it. Once in a while there is. In our writing group last week, we had one person who'd been either stripped of identity or who had been, grown in a test tube and had had no experience and then just dropped in and was being given experience. I'm not sure what it is yet, but that person has no identity. It makes perfect sense that this person has no identity. The other 2 people, there was no good reason to not give us their name in line 1. So, err on the side of giving us their name. Okay? All right. So, how is omniscient? What is omniscient then?
You're in everyone's head at once.
Okay, usually not at once, but... Yes. James Joyce. We're not going to emulate James Joyce. Let's just stay away from that. If you feel like emulating James Joyce, then this is not the class. So, I had to read Finnegan's Wake like 3 times in college. Not Finnegan's Wake, Dubliners. I had to read Dubliners so many times. I'm so tired of Dubliners. You can't call a story of the dead and have no zombies. All right, this is a little bit harder to do because to show in one line. I'm on the way to the store. Joe thought. The person, now let's see, we'll say, Mary saw Joe and wondered if he knew he'd forgotten his pants. So, if you have a paragraph where those are, you're starting, those two lines, one after another, you're in omniscient. Omniscient is the genre where you are, as the narrator, whoever the narrator is, has access to everyone's thoughts, emotions, understanding. They know what's going to happen. If you ever have a sentence in your book that says, "Little did he know," you have entered omniscient. Okay? And writers cheat on this all the time. As long as you know what you're doing, you can cheat. For instance, the first paragraph of every Wheel of Time book is in omniscient. And then from then on, they're third limited. Right. Do you guys notice this? So, you can cheat on omniscient. Orson Scott Card in the original Ender's Game, I think he may have changed some of this in later versions, I don't know. But once in a while, you're in Bean's head. It's like, boom, hey, Bean. You're like, whoa, Ender walks off stage and Bean has some thoughts. This was much more common in the old days, before we kind of got our feet underneath us and realized that the learning curve advantages of these usually outweigh the occasional lapse into omniscient, though it can still be an interesting tool, like the first paragraph of the Wheel of Time and things like that. Normally, I'm going to say to all of you, you should be in one of these two, unless you have a compelling reason to be in this one. And if you do, go for it. But if you're going to do that, I suggest you read a couple of really good omniscient books and decide why your book is omniscient. And next, we're going to break down, let's talk about what you gain and lose from each of these three types. What does the tool give you? Why would you pick one as opposed to the others? What does first person do really well? People who haven't taken my class before. I saw some hands going up. Yeah, in the back.
Well, the first person, it's somebody's opinion, so you
Okay.
don't hold it to such high scrutiny. So you allow
Okay,
them
yes,
to say
yes.
errors without being doubtful of what they're saying.
You can be, that's a wonderful thing, you can be much more untrustworthy as a narrator. You can do this in the other ones, but it's so much easier in first person. Yes? Yes, it is really good at characterizing the speaker. Okay? So these are advantages. There's another big one, I think, yeah.
It's easier to keep it secrets from the reader.
Yeah, that's the untrustworthy narrative thing, though, but yeah, secrets. The other big one is info dumps in voice. All right, info dumps in voice. And this is kind of a little more obscure one to figure out, but we're going to talk a lot about how to get information across to the reader in an interesting and engaging way. If you are able to have a really hilarious first-person character voice, the book I read before this one was The Amulet of Samarkand, Jonathan Stroud. One of the main characters is a first-person voice of a demon, a djinn, who's been bound by a young wizard. And his voice is great. It's delightful, it's hilarious, it's sarcastic and arrogant, and it's very distinct. And so when he starts to say, well, this was this sort of thing, since it's in character voice and it's laden with all this untrustworthy narrator sort of stuff, it's a blast to read the info dumps, right? That is a huge advantage, particularly if you're good at writing a character voice that is fun to read. Now, if your character voice is not fun to read, if your character's Eeyore, then, first-person viewpoint from Eeyore can get really on your nerves after a while. I suppose Bartimaeus can too, but so info dumping in voice, that's kind of a writerly advantage. What potential disadvantages do we have from first person? Yes? Yeah, it's harder to do multiples. I doubt you guys can even read this, but I like writing it on the board. It gives you time to type it out. At least it stops me from blabbing for a few minutes. Okay, harder to do multiple characters. Why would you think this is?
Well, you're trying to focus on one character and all that they're thinking, and so you can't get into the heads of everyone else.
Yeah.
Unless you
Technically,
switch
yeah.
viewpoints.
Yeah, you can switch viewpoints, but it is difficult. I've seen some good books that'll do two first persons, and they usually will name each chapter after the character. That's the I character. One of the problems is since you're using I, everyone forgets your character's name. A lot of the times, unless you do a lot to reinforce it. And beyond that, you as a writer are working so hard on this character, since the narrator is inherently less trustworthy, then getting into other people's heads is a lot harder.
I've read some stories where the main narrative is in first person, but
Yeah.
then they have interludes in third person limited.
Yeah, Bartimaeus is that as well. The other characters in third. So is Name of the Wind is another good example of this, and things like this. This is a nice tool. I think it works pretty well. It's something you can mix up, and I think it's one of those ones. The more I've seen it done, the more I think it's one you can play with as a new writer without getting into too much trouble. It's more dangerous in some ways to have two first persons than to have a first and a third, but it's really up to you. In the back, what did you want to add?
It's hard to get information across that you want the reader to know, but the first person character does not know.
Yes. If they don't know it, then you can't show it. Now, there are ways around this by having multiple bit narrators or doing the third person, but at its core, first person has this sort of limitation. Generally, the books I've read, they're really good at getting one character's voice across. But if you have a whole book full of people where you're working that hard to get their voices across, doing two, it works. Once you get into three, it can get really tough. So it tends to be a little bit worse. It's not to say you can't do it, but it tends to be a little bit worse at doing multiple characters. Any other disadvantages that you can think of? Yeah.
Sense of security that you can't kill off the main character.
Yeah, there is that sense of security. There's the sense they lived. Now that may not be true, though I will tell you the first person character who gets killed off, surprise, surprise at the end, or they've been a ghost all along and they were killed off, now they're telling the story. That twist was done the second day someone wrote a first person book. And so that's not to say you can't do it, but be aware it is not going to be a big surprise to a lot of readers, because someone invents first person, says, okay, this person's telling a story. What twist can we do? Hey, they actually are dead. So you don't know that they survived to the end. So yeah.
I've seen, I've read a couple like Gregory Maguire where, like the Ugly Stepsister, like the Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, and it changes. It's not like it's first person.
Yeah.
But it throws a different twist to who the first person is when you get to the end of the book.
Okay. We will get into variants on first person in a few minutes here. I want to get down what they're good at and what they aren't good at, but there are some variants that we'll dig into. That some variants have been designed in order to mitigate some of these disadvantages or to take better advantages of the advantages. Let's move over to third limited. Now, third limited, it has become the standard in science fiction and fantasy over the last 20 years. That isn't to say that you can't do first. This is just the standard. I would say that in teen, first has kind of become the standard. And then you do see some third, but first is the default. And so if you're just going to pick one of these to write in, and you're like, I really don't know what I should do, if you're writing teen, usually you can default to first person, you'll be all right. If you're writing epic fantasy, science fiction, any of these, you can default to third person limited, and you'll be okay. Anyone want to guess why that is? Why those two have defaulted to different things?
Teenagers are all about me, so.
There is that sort of sense, but there's also, yeah, I agree with that.
There's more that happens in epic fantasy. You have to do a lot of things.
Yeah, a lot of the adult, these books are trying to get across a sense of epic fantasy, which has the idea of immersion being a big part of it, or they are this grand space opera where you want to be in multiple places at once, or whatnot. And so because of that, and these have naturally gravitated toward, they're limited, which is better at multiple characters, whereas teen books tend to, number one, be shorter, tend to, number two, be about one person, Not always, but they tend to be focusing on one distinct narrative, and this is better at that. And so they've gravitated toward the tool that is better. But again, you can do whatever you want, and you'll find omniscient in both of them. So, all right, third person limited. So, just to give you a foundation in third limited, if you're unaware, third limited is where, for a given scene, you pick a character, you get across to us, usually in sentence number 1, but at least paragraph number 1, who the main character of this scene is, and then you try to filter everything through their eyes. You try to be more trustworthy than this, even though a character, what a character sees, you can still play with untrustworthiness. Robert Jordan did a great example of this with Matt. Matt was kind of an untrustworthy narrator. It's third limited. He would see something, and then you would see his interpretation of it, and you'd say, that is not what's happening, Matt. You are interpreting that all your own way. But the distinction is, they show you what happened, and the information isn't withheld from you, and then you see the character's interpretation. With first person, you have to just trust what they saw when they're telling you, I saw this. And so there's a sense of trustworthiness that happens in third limited. But you try very hard not to show anything that the character doesn't see. So for instance, if a character is facing the wrong way and someone comes in the door, you can't say this person came in the door. Instead, you say, he heard someone enter and turned and saw this person. You try very hard to be showing everything through the camera lens of the character, but everything in narrative, while colored by that character, is really more solidly grounded in what the narrator's doing. There are different ways to approach this, but that's third limited. It's a little bit harder to do, I feel. But when it works real well, it gives you some advantages. Granted, this can be awesome when it's done really well. I love a great first person. But I think third person has its advantage. So let's see, what good things, other than what I just described, do you get by being able to do this? Obviously, I'll put up the one that does multiple characters really well. If you are the type of reader or writer who likes the one viewpoint throwaway, right? The character where you're doing all this stuff, and then you jump to the character on the wall who's watching it all happen, and then they get an arrow in the neck. If you're the person that likes, here's one page from this person's viewpoint. This is the viewpoint style to use, rather than this one in most cases. What other advantages can you guys think of? Matt?
You have a little more leeway and authorial voice.
Yeah, you do. Very, very astute to point out. Leeway, I should write the whole thing. Authorial voice. This means that in your narrative, you can cut it. Like if you're showing the viewpoint of a 3-year-old, in first person, you've got to stick to that 3-year-old's voice. And only write like your 3-year-old would. In third limited, you're pulling in a little bit of omniscient, and you're going to change your narrative to say, Sophie saw a duck. She really liked ducks. So she walked over to grab the duck and things like this, where Sophie probably couldn't even say, I like ducks, so I walked over to grab the duck. Where in first person, her first person would be, duck! Right? You can see how that leeway happens, right? That you're allowed to kind of describe it as a 3-year-old might, but you can get some wiggle room. In another way, you can kind of have your prose be a little more flowery than the character would be capable of doing or would naturally do. You don't want to push this too far because you want to give a sense we're we're seeing through their eyes, but you don't have to go quite as far into the character voice, which can be an advantage sometimes. What else can we do? Yeah?
I've always liked the tension that comes when the reader knows something certain characters don't.
Yes. Tension of secrets. Great. You can do that really well in third person by jumping to another thing. And I think you can show the breadth of a story and world. You can just make things so much bigger in some ways by doing lots of viewpoints across lots of places. Anything else you guys like about third person limited? I will write up here the narrator trustworthy. The very more trustworthy, that's what it says. Oh yeah.
I like that you can view something one way and then have somebody else view that person in a completely different way, so you get to know the character from different aspects.
Yeah, different views on the same character. And you can do this sometimes in a first person, where you can have an event happen and have 3 different people describe what happened in that event through their own eyes. We were just talking at business meeting today about an episode of X-Files. You remember that, where they did that? Where they, X-Files is too old for you people. But yeah, they did the movie Hero, which is a great Hong Kong film, does this. It's like, here's what happened. Well, this is what another way to interpret the same story. Yeah, and things like that. So different views, but with third limited, you can describe a character through someone else's eyes, and then describe him through someone else's eyes, and it can add things. What are your limitations? What does third limited not do? It's going to be pretty easy to contrast since I've written these both up on here, but let's go ahead and spell them out. What do you lose by going third limited instead of picking one of the others?
You don't get as immediate a connection with the character.
Yeah, it's a little harder to build connections. And any others? I'm going to add the contrast to the info dumps up here. You got to be really careful with your info dumps. Info dumps are harder. I don't know what it is about human nature that does this, but for the majority of us, when we look at a page and it is someone saying, in the first person talking about their life, we feel this immediate connection, and we will read it a little bit easier. Whereas if we see the dense paragraph of he or she, then it's a little, just a fraction harder for us. Even if the only thing changed is the I versus he, we see that dense paragraph, and that feels like a dense paragraph. Where at the I, it's like, oh, it's light and fluffy, even though you've changed nothing else. Yeah.
So we're all about expression and
Yes.
individualism today.
Mm-hmm.
So are readers like more judgmental towards you personifying what someone else is thinking compared to the I form where someone's just saying what they're feeling?
That's potential. That's possible. I don't know. I'm not sure on the psychology of that specifically. But I do know that it just, the info dumps, readers are more likely, here's one thing to just keep in mind. Readers' eyes will follow dialogue and skip non-dialogue. If there is dialogue on the page, they will look to the dialogue. First person feels like dialogue to them. And so naturally, this is one of those things that if you're writing in a rhythm, this is kind of one of those prose things, but I'll mention it now since we're on the prose idea. If your rhythm is dialogue, big line of text, dialogue, big line of text, dialogue, big line of text, that's going to be a really awkward thing to read for a lot of readers. They're either going to naturally try to go to the dialogue and skip it, or they're going to just feel fits and starts. Whereas if it's broken up like this, dialogue, 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 all these lines of text in a paragraph down here, this reads more naturally to a lot of us, for whatever reason. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and the building your prose and things like that. That's not to say you don't want some beats in here to give what's going on, but one very easy thing for readers to read is dialogue, 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 dialogue. We love that. We get to it and we're like, zip! And anything that's breaking that up too much is going to be something that's going to throw off that zip. It's going to be zip, zip, instead of a big zip through the dialogue. So, let's go ahead and touch on omniscient. Now, there may be some people who are not quite as familiar with omniscient. They're like, so what's the difference between omniscient and third person limited? Well, omniscient is doing everyone's head at once. And there are multiple ways to do this, but the idea is you get a sense that someone is telling you the story. Almost every omniscient, really there's the two categories, but almost everyone has a present narrator of some sort. There is ones that don't. but the easiest way to explain omniscient, if you're a little bit confused by it, is to bring up The Hobbit. The Hobbit is an excellent example of an omniscient book with a present narrator, because The Hobbit is written by Bilbo after he has gone on this mission and things like that, but he chooses to not write it, I believe, in first person, right? He writes it about, there was a hobbit who lived in a hole. Not I lived in a hole. But it is about him. And so there's this narrator who is expressing what people's thoughts are, because we can assume after the fact he's talked to them or he's guessed, and he's presenting it as a story. The classical storyteller form is kind of this. This is why the omniscient was kind of a much bigger deal before we've kind of gotten into the modern era, because people were more used to, I think, the idea of the storyteller. Someone was telling you the story. Who's telling you this story? Well, they have all the facts, and they're going to present it to you in an interesting way, and so they're going to show you everyone's thoughts. Jonathan Strange, Mr. L, which I said I'm reading right now, this is an omniscient voice where someone after the fact is recording all of this for you, and so they know what everybody's thinking, and they're including it for you at various points. Now, there are omniscient books with no present narrator. Dune is probably the most famous of these. Maybe you guys can throw out some other ones to me. But what Frank Herbert likes to do in Dune is, you should go read it if you're interested in this, is people walk on stage, he shows you what they're thinking. And what he'll do is, it's like there's a narrator telling a story, interjected with first-person thoughts in italics by all the people who are in the story. David Lynch, who made the first Dune movie, had a hard time figuring out how to make a movie out of this. Did anyone watch that movie? Do you remember how suddenly you just hear people's thoughts? Like all the time? It's so weird. Go watch it. It's surreal. Paul is sitting there, waiting, and then you get his whole thought process of oh, that's probably Gurney who walked through the door, or something like that. It's like, you're like, are they psychic? Are they talking with their minds? You don't know, because he's trying to imitate the first person, or the omniscient narrator that Frank Herbert uses in the book and transition it to the screen, which is amazing that he was that wonderfully faithful to that, and then changed everything else. But it is a fun movie. If you've never seen, Sting is wearing spandex in the movie, and you've got Jean-Luc Picard in a pre-Jean-Luc Picard role. It's interesting. But anyway, Dune has no present narrator. It's my favorite omniscient book. And it just simply uses this rule of, I can access anyone's thoughts that I want to at any time. So the narrator, there's a narrator saying it, but you don't know who it is, and then they can access the thoughts. So, advantages, disadvantages. What are the advantages of omniscient? Yeah.
You can get foreshadowing.
You can get foreshadowing. You can do little did he know. Probably don't want to do little did he know, but you can do things like that. A great example of this is in Dune. I believe as soon as, what's his name, there's a traitor character who's going to betray everybody. As soon as we jump into his head, he says, I'm going to betray everybody, and this is how I'm going to do it. And so it's a very different foreshadowing. You can kind of show whatever you want, but it also kind of creates this tension of, it's this sort of dread. The characters don't know, but you have all the information. Really, you can kind of pick and choose what you like out of these two things and use them all, right? A lot of omniscient books will have intrusions by a first-person narrator who does some of this stuff. And will occasionally, they give you thoughts here, thoughts there. It's a lot more free form. You can pull whatever you want and use it. So what's the disadvantage? Why don't we do this a lot if it's so awesome?
It seems like you're really jarring for the reader.
It is.
If lingering with one person too long.
It can be way confusing if it's done wrong. All right? Even if it's done right, it can be pretty darn confusing. Yeah.
If you look at I've heard a lot of people, you're not supposed to try to teach something, not show a truth. I've heard a lot of teachers say that. And if you were trying to teach a truth, and you were trying to teach it through 3 or 4 perspectives versus one, it would be way harder to teach it. And so it's like if you have an agenda in your writing or anything, and you're writing in the omniscient, you have to have such a clear understanding of the truth
Okay.
than you would if you were just writing how you feel from an I-form or something. It's a lot
Okay.
harder to write that way.
Yeah, right here.
And say consistency, it probably goes with the jarring, but just being consistent in whose head you're in.
Yeah.
I mean, that, because if you spend all your time, I don't know.
Yeah, the best omniscient books that I've read tend to make up some rules for themselves. Like if you read Dune, he's very good at, I'm going to show you everyone's thoughts. I'm not going to withhold anything from you. And if you don't keep to your own kind of rules in that way, then suddenly it gets very jarring and the reader's like, well, why don't we get their thoughts? Or it can be really upsetting and things like this. Yes?
Harder to form a personal relationship with
Yeah.
the character.
It's much harder. This is the big one, I would say. And it's much harder to form relationships with the characters because some of the reader's natural inclination will be to bond to the narrator. And beyond that, it'll feel to you like all these people are kind of more, you see them, that they're marionettes more, that the author is playing with. And because of that, you see the form of the book in a different shape. And this, when it's a book that you know someone has written, that takes a lot of the edge off of that. When you're like, all right, this is what Bilbo has written. But in that case, you automatically know that Bilbo survives, which takes this big kind of potential flaw of first person and makes it a huge flaw over here, because you know that the person writing this. And if it's not a character that's the main character in the book, you start bonding to the narrator instead of the main character in the book, which you have this problem. And so it can throw all kinds of problems into this whole bonding idea.
You also have to do a lot more development of each character.
Yeah.
They all have to have their own voice to be much more.
Yes, you do. You do. And so this is just really hard. Particularly if you want to do it as Frank Herbert did. Which is one of the reasons I think Frank Herbert was such a genius. He did this really well. If you want to do the present narrator, it makes it a bunch easier. But even then, you're going to have some of these problems of bonding. Now, this is why I say that if you are, let me use my phone for time instead. Okay, if you are unsure what you're going to do, pick one of these two that appeals to you, match it to your genre, and go forward. If you like omniscient, then you can do awesome stuff with omniscient. But do it consciously, and know, I'm writing omniscient. These are the problems. I'm going to work with those and deal with it. And make sure you go read a few good omniscient books and see the tools they're using. I am not great at omniscient. I can point you toward people who are, but I myself have not practiced it because I like these two so much more. It's just a personal writing style of mine. I like reading omniscient, but I don't like writing it as much. All right? Let's talk about a few varieties of different types of particularly first and third, because there are some different ways to approach these. First tends to have the most variation I've seen, because people like to play with it. As we said, the hybrid first and third is one way. Another interesting one is what we call the epistolary. And I'm just going to scribble because I don't know how to spell that. Epistolary. You can look it up. Anyone? What's an epistolary? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. You got to take it.
It's a story told through letters or like newspaper articles
Yes.
or that kind of thing. So you have little chunks of first person in an overall arcing narrative.
That's right. That's epistolary. Two famous examples. Dracula is told epistolarily. There's a book called Sorcery and Cecilia. Did I get the name right? That's epistolary, and I think the book was actually written epistolary, where the two authors of it were writing letters back and forth to themselves and to each other as the characters, and then they published it. It's a delightful book. But I'm not sure. I cannot remember Frankenstein. Isaac loves that book. Screwtape Letters. Screwtape Letters is epistolary. So it's this fun take on first person, which can do some goofy fun things, and you can hybrid that in. But I want you to be aware of that. Yeah.
One advantage you can do in Dracula specifically, you have one character who he's captured by Dracula and he's there for months and he escapes, and then we jump over to his fiancée. She has no idea what's going on. He's late coming home. There's a lot of tension figuring out what has happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you see these through like wiki history, one of my favorite short stories. It's online. You can download it. It's kind of epistolary done as forum posts on the Time Travelers Forum. And it's hilarious. It's great. I'll go read it. But you can do some really fun stuff with epistolary form. It feels a little gimmicky unless you work really hard. That would be the disadvantage, I would say.
I was just thinking, there's a book that I love called The Conspiracy Kings.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of toys almost the second person because it's epistolary.
Yeah.
It keeps saying you, and you don't know until halfway through who you is.
Who you is, yeah. Yeah, the book, The Prestige, is also partially epistolary, if not all. I can't remember. But it's a great book. If you watch the movie, the book's great too. And it does some of these same things where you're not sure who the audience is sometimes, and it does some really cool things with that. So that's one of the first person variations. Another big variation that I see a lot in YA is normally, I would say the normal for first person is it's somebody's writing down this story after they've experienced it. A great example of one that's just like this is Robin Hobb's Assassin's Apprentice. Is first person, he's writing his memoirs. And that's what our default usually is with first person. However, what's been big you guys got all this, right? Yep. What's big in the YA area right now is kind of like a sort of cinematic first person. Epistolary, is that right? That's spelled wrong. Sure. Epistolary, that O is wrong.
It is O.
It is O?
Yes.
Okay, I got it right. All right, epistolary. The other one, I don't want to call it cinematic because Orson Scott Hard has a definition for cinematic viewpoint, but it's like this over the shoulder YA thing. I don't know what else to call it because what it is first person, but it's as if you're accessing the thoughts of the main character in the moment that is happening to them. It's like you have a recording chip in their brain. And you are seeing, it's more like a third person with an eye. It's this really interesting thing. What are some books in this? Divergent, yeah, Uglies. Yeah, a lot of the big YA of the last 10 years have been in this sort of thing. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to mitigate this lack of immediacy that sometimes first person has, where you're like, yeah, but this all happened in the past. They're usually writing in present tense, not always, but often it's present. Present tense, and it's almost like they decided to blend these two but use the I. It's a really interesting form that feels fairly new to me. I didn't see this a lot in the 80s, and that it's become almost the default in YA right now because of some of the big books that got so popular using it. When I write YA folks, would you guys agree with me? And it is a cool form. I like that it's able to kind of take one of the big disadvantages of first person and swap it for one of the big advantages in third. It feels weird if you ever sit back and think about it. That's the only thing I don't like about it. You're like, wait a minute. What's going on here? Do we have a chip in their mind? But in the moment, it's just very readable and it works. So if you're writing YA, I would suggest that you kind of look at that one and see if it's a style that you want to use. It's kind of like the omniscient without the present narrator. There's no present person. They're not writing down their thoughts. You're just getting them right as it happens. But they're not writing stream of consciousness. That's the thing you have to understand. This is not a stream of consciousness, right? It's not fitting its way. It is really just a third person that they've done with I instead. All right? So let's see. Are there any other first person variants? I think there's probably some wacky ones, but those are the big ones I see right now. Third person, I'm trying to think if there are any variants on third person. I know I've used one as an example before. I don't think it was a very good one. Because third person has kind of been codified into what it is. It is this thing. It is the thing that Robert Jordan used. And he wasn't the one who invented it, but he was a very dominant force in third person. But it's been around. I mean, Anne McCaffrey used it in the Dragon Riders books. And she was very good at it. You pick the one character, you stick to it. I would say that the big variant would be whether you stick in a character's head for a whole chapter, or whether you let a line break, jump you to a new viewpoint, or if you decide I'm going to do one viewpoint for, the whole book. Usually you don't want to do that because, but you can. I've read plenty of books that are like that. So there you are. Let's do a brief talk on tense, just so that we know. It's going to be really brief. The brief talk on tense is pick present tense or past tense, and they're basically the same. You think that they're not, because you're like, wait, present tense and past tense, you're like, they are different things. One's going to be more immediate, right, Brandon? Maybe. The thing is, our brains are so good at filtering this stuff that by the time you're a few chapters in, you barely notice which one is which for most of us. If you're used to one and you read the other, the first chapter you read will be like, oh, I hate this. What's wrong with this? Oh, it's present tense. Ow! But then after a while of reading it, your brain just blends it together. I would say that past tense is the standard for epic fantasy and most speculative fiction adult works, and present tense and past tense are divided about half and half in YA. I see maybe a little bit more present tense, and that might be because of the popularity of putting the present tense with that first person thing. But it's not as big a deal as you think, unless you switch in your book, which is, don't do this unless you have a really good reason. If you want to do it, you can go read Speed of Dark by Elizabeth Moon. It won the Nebula Award. She switches tenses. The autistic character is always in present tense and everyone else is in past tense. And it's a device she uses in order to kind of get across that, that this person thinks differently from everyone else. And it works really well because when you read one chapter one way and another chapter the next way, you get that jarring sense every chapter, and it's really cool. But in most cases, just pick one. If you're not sure what you're doing, pick present tense and YA and past tense and not. All right, very, very easy. Do you all know? You all know what I mean by present and past tense, right? You're in a 300 level class. I would assume you've at least gotten that much. So, and I rarely read somebody's writing that they don't know that they haven't picked one. So there you are. By the way, present and past tense can be really weird in first person because you have to make these decisions. You're like, if they're writing it in the future, but they know this character even then, do they refer to them in the present tense? They say, oh yeah, John is my good buddy. Because they is your good buddy, because you're writing this when... And so, there's a little weirdness there when you're doing that you kind of have to make a judgment call on your own. And usually the easiest thing is just to put it all in past. John was my good buddy. He still is your good buddy. And if you were actually writing in your journal, you would write is. But if you just all write it in was, then no one gets confused. But you've got some flexibility and some leeway here. So. All right. So, boom. That's our tense thing. Hopefully you have thought about your tense, and if you haven't, that's probably more than you ever wanted to know. Let's talk about info dumps, now that we have this under our belt. Info dumps, info dumps, info dumps. You, and I have like, what, 5 minutes left or something for info dumps? 10, so we'll have to do this in a very informative, quick way. It's like showing straight down. Info dumps. Your job as a writer is to convey the information in a really interesting way where the world building is not a hindrance to them enjoying the story, but enhances them enjoying the story. This is difficult. Your natural inclination will be to stop for a paragraph and give them all the information they need. You will find books to do this. I do this. Everybody does this. The thing about it is that's kind of the easiest and weakest way that you can get your information across. And so, you have to think of your world building as the thing that you want to be unobtrusive as possible. You want your character to take the forefront of everything, and you want to work the world building into the cracks, so to speak, or in a way that just feels smooth and natural. Now, the Watson character, as has been brought up, is one way to make it smooth and natural. It doesn't make it any less a punch to the face, but it feels natural in the story, and so the reader will accept it. So if you can put the info dump in dialogue, that's just one of the easy tricks to get your information across. Because of what I said about dialogue earlier, right? People tend to zip through dialogue. It's light. It looks on the page like it's easy to read because there's lots of white space. And so because of that, anything in dialogue is a little bit easier to read. The problem with that is you have to avoid maid and butler. Main butler is a screenwriting term that we use for, in the old days, you would have these stage plays where they wanted to bring everyone up to speed really quickly, so they would have the maid and the butler come on stage to start the story, and the maid would say, "As you know, butler, the master is away for the weekend," and the butler would say, "Yes, and as you know," and they would just go back and forth with "as you knows." We call it "as you know, Bob," which feels really awkward. And when something feels awkward, people stop reading. When something is awkward, they stop and they say, "Oh yeah, this is a book, not a story that I'm becoming part of. It's a construct." And when they see this in a construct, then they're less engaged, and it undermines everything else you're trying to do. So, that's your danger. That's why the Watson character who doesn't know anything is been used. But even that can get a little overused. Really, what you want to do is you want to take this adage of show, don't tell. Another screenwriting term, but it's a general writing term all around. The idea with this is that we are trying to find ways to convey into our information to our readers by showing it happening. The one I use a lot is, instead of saying, "He was a nervous person," you have him tapping as he's waiting on something. That's a very obvious one, but it goes much deeper than this. If you want to convey to your reader that this is a world with lots of politics, and things like this, then you open your book with a scene of a big debate, a grand debate in the political houses. If you want to show that this is like a Greek god sort of world, and the gods created the world, and they're these very mercurial individuals who are always smiting the people and stuff like that, instead of starting as a fantasy book probably would have in the 70s and 80s, with a prologue that says, "And here's the lore of the gods." Instead, you devise a scene where the main character is trying to avoid getting struck by lightning because of something they did. One is this long sort of textbook, "This is what happened," and it's boring. It just really is. There's nothing against the writers who use those, because we were figuring this all out. But it's really boring. And if you can show a character, the big problem with it is you're not getting your character in that. You're getting lore. If you instead show your character dodging a lightning bolt and saying, "I should not have said his name in vain," suddenly you're like, "Oh yeah, the gods are real. They smite people." And it's got kind of a sort of lighthearted flair because the character's like thinking this sarcastic thought. Your character is sarcastic, your character is a blasphemer, your gods are vengeful, they're real. You've gotten all of those things across in one line. Well, two, really, from what I just said, as opposed to this big old thing where you spent 5 or 6 paragraphs beating into our head how vengeful the gods are. You want to look for ways that you can convey this information. And you want to do it for all aspects of your world. You want to do it for all aspects of your characters. Another Kurt Vonnegut quote, someone can Google this. You want to try to have every sentence you write do two of 3 things. 3 if you can. Evoke setting, progress the plot, or evoke character. And you want every sentence to try to do 2 of those 3 things. 3 if you can. And that's great advice. And that's what we mean by this. And so the infodumps are things you want to kind of slip in. So another way is you can kind of do this dialogue where, we go back to dialogue, where you're having characters talk, and it's like, talk, 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 talk. He picked up such and such thing. It's what we call a beat. It shows where he is in relation to the world around him. And that little thing can be a world-building element. He picks up the silver dagger that the priest used for sacrificing and inspects it. And then talk, 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 beat. And then you give another piece of the world building. You stop for a second, and he's got this dagger, and he thinks, "Is this the one that killed my dad?" Instead of having paragraph at the beginning, "When Joe was a young man, his father was taken by the priest and murdered. And this celebratory rite for the gods that did this," and stuff like that. You instead have this sort of dialogue, zip, and then you stop with one of these things, and then kind of go into some things, and then you go to dialogue and zip again. You can squeak these things in between the cracks, which is one method of doing it. It's not the only method. devising scenes where you convey all of this, using your first person or your third person as a lens through which they see the world. A great example of this is you can show a lot about your character by how they see something simple, like you've got a character who walks into a room. If that character's an archaeologist, they think something different. They notice a pillar and say something about it. And that one line you can evoke, this is an archaeologist, and this pillar is awesome. But if the character instead is not, an archaeologist, if the character is instead, whatever, is a violinist, you have them step in and, they listen to the music that's playing over the intercom or whatever, and they know what key it's in. And say, oh, I like that, but I really like this other guy's interpretation of this piece so much better. I can't believe they're playing the elevator version, right? So you've got this character, and you're evoking who they are by what they notice in the setting around them. If you can do that, if you can evoke character, setting, and all of these things through the little lines that you put of description, then you're achieving this thing that I call the grand skill, which is world building without the reader noticing that you're world building. And if you can do that, when people pick up your book, your story, they're going to be like, wow, this is pretty awesome. I'm getting this character, and it's easy to read. Now, sometimes that's not what you're looking for. Use these tools as you want, but this is the general thing that you want to practice. If you can get really good at this, you can do so many things with your fiction that are so awesome that you will find success as a writer. Even if you're bad at some of these other big, large-scale things, if you can do this, it makes your writing fun to read. You're going to get way ahead on everyone else. So we will do another week on this, not next week. Isaac, break down for my next one. We didn't get to the pyramid of abstraction, and we didn't get to concrete language, and we didn't get to following the character's attention. So if you write those things down, we'll make sure we do those on the next Prose week. Next week, however, we're going to jump probably to plot. We can dig into plotting methodologies, large scale. Yeah. Yeah, I forgot them. I'm sorry. But I'll bring them next week. I told Isaac. It's Isaac's fault, right? Yeah, I'll get those to you in a second. Anyway, bring up to me your sheets and things like that. Any questions you have for me, I'll be here for the next whatever. Guys in the workshop, you have a 10-minute break. Go get a drink. I'll be over.